when God pulls you out of those trenches, when God pulls you out of some of the tough things in life. It changes you and it makes you trust Him more. And so I was just thinking about raising confident Christians, or raising confident children. And I was trying to figure out, who is the most confident kid in the Bible? And there's so many stories in the Bible, and it didn't take me long to really stumble upon David. Right? I mean, everyone knows David, King David. But when he was a boy, there's a war going on. And it's on. No one told me that. You guys saw it and didn't mention it. Thank you, guys. But Israel, there was a war going on between Israel and the Philistines, the Philistine. And so both armies had assembled on opposite hills during this day, and the battle lines had been drawn. And instead of having the armies fight, they would have the champion come out. One guy would come out and he would call out to the other country, the other army, so that they would only have one person fight each other, and so the whole armies wouldn't have to be destroyed. And so some of the story, right? This dude that comes out, he's over 9 feet tall, right? I mean, he's huge, Goliath, right? He comes out, he's over 9 feet tall, and the tallest man on record, I think in medical terms, is like 8'11". So he's huge. This guy is massive, right? And he comes out, and there's a Jewish writer who quoted him saying this. He said, "I am Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, who killed the 2 sons of Eli and led into captivity the Ark of the Covenant of Jehovah and placed it in the temple of Dagon, my God. Also in our battles I have gone at the head of the army." And then he calls out Saul. He says, "Men of Israel, what has Saul done that you make him king? If he is a hero, let him come down and fight me. But if he is weak and afraid, then one of you will do." I mean, he really calls out everybody. He comes over and he's calling out. He said, "Man, I've got your God where I want him. I took his most valuable possession, the Ark of the Covenant, and I put it in my God's temple." And then he calls out Israel's king, right? And he says, if he's so tough, if he's so strong, bring him out. I'll take him. I mean, so obviously he's 9 feet tall. He's been fighting since a kid. They said, the Bible says, "You're not going out there, right? Are you going? I'm not going." Right? I mean, this guy is massive. And so it went on for 40 days. For 40 days, Goliath would come out and would just start yelling all this stuff about how nasty your country is and just ragging on him for 40 days, until one day Jesse, David's dad, sent David to the army on a food run. Right? Because David, he wasn't big enough to be in the army. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't old enough. Sent him on a food run. He had to take sandwiches to the army. Okay, and so we'll pick it up at 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 20. It says, "Early in the morning, David had left the flock with a shepherd. He loaded up and set out. He reached the camp, and as the army was going out to his battle position, shouting the war cry, David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers." Verse 23, "As he was talking with them, Goliath stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. And when the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, 'Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He keeps coming out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage. He will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel.' You get anything. This is it. If you could pull this off, you're the man." And so David says to Saul, jump to verse 32, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." You can imagine the look on Saul's face. And Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy. And he has been fighting a man. He has been a fighting man from his youth. He's been fighting longer than you've been alive," is what he says. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he defies the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. That's a confident kid, right? I mean, that's a confident kid to be able to go to his king, for one, dress his king, and say, you gotta let me do this. I can take this out. I know your biggest, baddest dudes aren't even willing to look at Goliath. They're not running in fear, but I can do this. And so, I want to raise a kid that has the confidence of David. You know, I mean, I would love to have my kid be able to take life by the horns when he sees the call in his life, when he sees what he's supposed to do, to be able to go and grab it. To be able and go and do what God has called him to do. Not that he'd be afraid to do it, not that he wouldn't think he could do it, but that he would know that he has the abilities to do what God's called him to do. So the question is, how? How do you raise a kid like David? Because David ended up being king. You know, the best king in Israel, you know, before Jesus became king of Israel. King of the Jews, right? And so David was the man in the Bible. In the Old Testament, he was the man. And so the first thing that I noticed in reading about David was his unshakable faith. He was, you know, while the entire nation was being held hostage by one man, David's the only one who sees it as a ridiculous sight. Right? Because the army's standing there and they're seeing this one guy. They're like, there's no way I can do this. But David doesn't see Goliath as a giant man who can kill him. Remember, he says in verse 26, David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David doesn't see him as a giant, but as an obstacle that's standing in the way of what God desires. And so there needs to be an understanding of who God is, and he understands it. He understands, remember how big God is. And that even though this 9-foot behemoth is standing in the way, he knows that his God is ultimately bigger. And when we talked about that last week, that faith, that unshakable faith begins in the home. Right? And that unshakable faith begins with us as parents living that life. And so we won't get back into that today.